excited to kick really excited to kick it off here with Nikhil, because I think, much like Andrew mentioned, the last year has been enormous for responsible AI and AI generally, especially generative AI. So giving an overview of a quick landscape of AI use cases, specifically in digital health, will set the stage for our conversation. So Nikhil, over to you to set the stage, and then we'll kick off with a discussion around that.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Alyssa. And you can see why Satish and I are so excited to be among this group, right? So we have one of the first and most successful CEOs of a digital health company. We have an investor, and then we have someone who ran what was a telehealth company and then brought digital health into that company and also represents the doctor and patient point of view. And then, of course, when we talk about responsible AI, Alyssa, hopefully you'll jump into the conversation as well because you are the expert in this group on that. Uh, when I think of digital health, and we say, okay, we're going to talk about digital health. It's a bit of a misnomer, right? Because pretty much any kind of healthcare today has digital components to it. And so I thought one of the ways to do this, to set this up, to tee up the discussion, would be to look at one of the taxonomies of digital health. And I picked this one, which is from the National Academy of Medicine. But all of these taxonomies essentially show that whatever you think about in healthcare, there's a digital component to it. So whether it is health information on the top, right on the top there, to do with EHRs and so on, that's digital. You look to 3 o'clock and you've got personal health devices, that's got a digital component to it. You look at this, at 6 o'clock, that's imaging. And so basically everything in healthcare has a digital component to it. And once it's got a digital component to it, well, there are applications for AI and GenAI in particular. And so one of the ways to think about it might be to say that, look, I just picked a few examples. There could have been examples for every one of these bubbles. But AI is being used to support human work. It's being used to augment human work, and it's being used to substitute human work. And so if you look right in the center, let's say those two, AI synthesis and alerts, looking at an EHR and synthesizing it or entering information into an EHR, or at the bottom, AI image analysis, you're really supporting humans in helping them be more efficient and do things with fewer errors and so on, right? So that's supporting. If you look over to the left, so integrating multimodal data or taking, the highly detailed second by second data from an implantable device like a loop recorder, it's just not possible for humans to, by themselves, do all the computation needed in order to get the value from that. So that's a place where AI is augmenting what a human can do and really enabling new kinds of care. And then if you look on the right, you actually have AI, which is in some ways substituting humans. And so, maybe Andrew can disagree or agree with me, but I think an AI symptom checker, and I've been using Buoy since pretty much the day it launched. I think it's a fantastic tool. It is replacing for me what a human being might be doing for me. At the bottom, you've got an AI therapy chatbot. And Rena, I know you will disagree with this, so let's provoke you into jumping into this conversation to say what therapy can be done by a human versus by an AI. And so I didn't think it was possible to set out a full landscape, but just to maybe set this out as a starting thought that applications exist across healthcare, and those applications either augment, support, or substitute humans. Okay, so I'll stop talking there and throw it back to you, Alyssa.
Thank you. And I think we've all agreed that we'll have some respectful conversation and disagreement around some of these topics among the panelists. And as we dive in, we'll have the panelists answering questions, but we're saving some time at the end to have a Q&A from the audience. So please do feel free to put some questions into the chat. So we got that great landscape, and I'm really curious to hear from our panelists, what are the opportunities that you're most excited about as it relates to digital health across all of those areas or beyond that Nikhil has outlined. I know generative AI is the big thing right now, but as Andrew mentioned, traditional AI has been very active for a very long time. So very excited to hear from your perspectives, what's catching your attention, has you the most excited. Pyle, let's start with you.
Yeah, thank you. And Nikhil, I actually think that was a helpful framing because you start to see almost the three different users or go-to-market perspectives, which is important around this responsible AI question. You have the consumer-oriented use cases, you had the physician-oriented use cases, and then you have the enterprise healthcare customer-oriented use cases. And Andrew, your perspective is going to be so interesting because you went from being a B2B business largely to a direct consumer. And I think that this vector is important in thinking about AI adoption as well, because it hinges on trust. I think we're sitting here today with consumers having a high degree of trust, like you, Nikhil, saying, I use Buoy Health to figure out, what my symptoms are. That's where we're seeing heightened adoption today, is around the consumer perspective. But there is also the heightened opportunity to mislead consumers with AI, particularly as it relates to healthcare. And how do we create the right guardrails and safety mechanisms to make sure you're not sending the consumer to the wrong place for the wrong symptom, et cetera. So that's a whole separate thing. But where I spend time is around enterprise healthcare. We don't invest in direct-to-consumer businesses. We invest in businesses that have a proposition for health plans or hospital systems, because we believe that is the way to really, if you want to impact healthcare in broad swaths, you've got to follow where the dollars flow, and most of the dollars flow through those entities. And there, the most mission critical functions for a health plan or a hospital system, they don't require AI today. They're looking for output, accuracy, explainability, hard dollar ROI, almost the things that are antithetical to generative AI. And so I was just talking to an entrepreneur this morning who's deep in prior authorization, which I think is a really great use case for automation and AI. It's a great use case for traditional automation and AI, but generative AI and LLMs will fall apart on some of the technicalities. And when you get into the depth of having to explain to a provider why the prior authorization was accepted or rejected, as an example. And then there's all the hallucination and all this other stuff. So I think that when you think about enterprise, it's going to be really important to think about traditional AI and its use cases versus generative AI. Generative AI, finally, I think is particularly well poised around things like voice-to-text doctor notes, discussion Q&A with data, research summarization, chart summarization, and co-pilots. And this goes back to Nikhil's framework. Who is adopting that? Individual physicians. And so, Rena, I think your thoughts on this is going to be really interesting, because the physicians, they're just burned out. They're looking for anything to alleviate the workload. And you see this massive adoption around these generative AI tools by these physicians. But the reality is the hospital system hasn't quite, and the enterprise hasn't quite caught up to that. So that's how I just highlight the curve right now. We're seeing great adoption with consumer and consumer use cases. Then we're seeing the next best with sort of provider, individual provider use cases, but enterprise is lagging, and we can talk a bit more about that as the discussion continues.
That's an excellent framing from the consumer, physician, enterprise kind of use case perspective. I think that gives a really great overview as we go into this conversation. So Andrew, very curious kind of what you're thinking about. And I know kind of you have a unique perspective on some of those.
Yeah, and Paul, I really appreciate your answer. I think that was really thoughtful and nuanced. I mean, just to dive into it, unsurprisingly, my favorite use cases are consumer facing, and maybe specifically consumer empowering. Because I think one really unspoken benefit of LLMs is that their ability to kind of piece together data that's very unstructured and make it usable by a consumer. So, just as an example, as Paolo just talked about, we used to sell to employers, insurance companies, health systems, so we're very B2B focused. And one notoriously difficult data set to wrangle was what is in or out of network for a single self-insured employer, because that HR team, bought very specific products or services for their member. And prior to LLMs, you probably had to put a phone, literally a call center with a bunch of humans on the phone to try to navigate like a really, difficult system. We just almost for fun started building these kind of like products for our own employees. Haven't released them, but just wanted to kind of highlight some of the stuff that we were like, wow, this is crazy. We could take a PDF of our benefit package from Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts. We could upload it. We could run a number of scripts on it that were relatively straightforward. And next thing you know, you had something that you could chat with that was not too dissimilar to talking to your HR benefit manager at a point of like decision. That's really amazing, because if I were to have tried to design a product to do what I just described a year ago, that would have taken me like pulling together like 15 different APIs from 15 different companies, somehow wrangling the insurance company to give me some data that they probably would never give me in order to build that thing, which is just like really astounding and really empowering for the consumer. One more just quick example. We did another prototype where you could upload an imaging study, and it would read the physician interpretation of the image. And this sounds like kind of like boring, but I think it's like magical in the sense that, sometimes this gets sent through the portal to the patient. You just get the read from the radiologist. And like they use a lot of words and like it's scary. And the thing that people wish was like, man, I wish I could just have my doctor on the phone walk me through what all these words mean, right? Kind of same thing with like lab tests and like those reads that come out. So kind of the same idea. We built this for our own employees. You could upload your lab tests, you could upload your imaging study, and you could converse with our product and ask questions to clarify, like, hey, is this worrisome? Is this not? Based on just the limited data that was provided, which was the read given by the clinician. And it just is so empowering in that, again, this would have taken a lot of work otherwise to kind of pull all these data sets together. So I think the opportunity here is like, instead of praying that insurance companies and EMRs and health systems, all somehow magically align tomorrow around some unified system, instead of praying for that day, I think the consumer can start to now take raw data and use new tools by market entrants, like the ones that maybe Pyle you're investing in, where the barrier to entry to building technology isn't that high anymore, because you're able to kind of use a lot of these generative AI, and then give those tools to the consumer so they can make sense out of this really crazy multi-layer cake that is healthcare. And I think that's exciting, not only for the companies that will make those tools, but for the consumer themselves. And so I feel like that's the biggest opportunity in my mind.
Andrew, I'm glad you used the word boring, because I think sometimes we think about AI in healthcare to, solve these like very, very large problems or, diagnosis and things like that. But I think some of the impact that especially we've seen in the health space are back office optimization, giving access and democracy to information that we may not understand. And so I'm glad you flagged that some of these use cases and applications are pretty significant for the consumer or people interacting in the system, that gets over some of those interoperability challenges that we see with, I think, the layered cake that you mentioned. So Rena, kind of last but certainly not least, on your perspectives of what makes you excited or interested in kind of the use cases and AI applications you're seeing.
Yeah, for sure. It's funny. This was not pre-planned, but I think, Pyle, of your three, consumer, MD, and enterprise, Andrew went straight to consumer. Your bent is all three, I know, but with a focus on companies that are dedicated to enterprise. My head went straight to the physician. So we sort of covered your three pillars as our three panelists. So I will say, like, my first thought in answering your question, Alyssa, is to just go to a couple of principles. One is to go back to first principles and always be remembering to think about what problem we're trying to solve And if AI, or generative AI more specifically, proves to be the tool in our quiver that is appropriate, great. I think there's a lot of chatter about where can we deploy AI? Where can we deploy generative AI? Where can we use large language models? I just encourage the listeners to just flip that and make sure we're always thinking about the problem. And in doing so, I go back to the triple aim or the quadruple aim, weaving in the provider, of course, patient experience, patient outcome, cost, and for that fourth pillar, the provider experience. And that's where my head goes. And I think if we can focus on the provider experience, it is always in service of the patient, their outcome, their experience, and overall cost. So it all kind of weaves together for me. A couple of examples of opportunities, Nikhil, you hit on some of them that I would have naturally gone to too in your earlier slide. And it goes back to like, what are the challenging problems in healthcare that we're facing? I mean, if you just think about the patient-physician encounter or the patient-clinician encounter, it's clunky, it's old school, it's administratively burdensome. It's not good for anyone. And I think there's several tools out there today that can be really useful applications of AI to listen and not transcribe, but translate that patient encounter into a note and save the physician or the clinician all that time, right? Between, to be utilized in service of the patient, and then also in service of efficiencies to be able to hopefully see more patients in the time that they have available to them. I think in diagnosis, right, the amount of knowledge that a physician has to hold in their head in the current era is already multiples of what I had to learn 25 years ago, and will continue to grow. It's just going to be impossible for us to be able to hold all that knowledge. And I think to use AI to sort of augment our diagnostic capabilities, I think will be huge. And then AI, AI in treatment. Nikhil teased me there with the chatbot. I think there's a role, but I think we have to be super wise and nuanced about where we apply AI-driven actual treatment of patients. There's places where it's great, and there's places where it's grossly inappropriate. And our job is to really tease out where AI can be applied wisely and responsibly, a nod to the organization's name, in service of patients and providers.
Yeah, one of the use cases that come to us all the time is we want an AI chatbot, but there's now pretty innumerable examples, especially when using like third-party LLMs that haven't been properly evaluated, where the outputs haven't been tested, and therefore, bad health recommendations, or even from an eating disorder nonprofit meaning to do the right thing is now giving like diet advice. And so it's really, really important when thinking about the tool, about kind of, Payal mentioned the guardrails. And I'm also really glad you talked about first principles, because oftentimes people will be like, we need to use AI for this. And one of our first questions is, have you established why you need to use AI? Like, what's the needs form that you're considering from an AI perspective? There's amazing questions in the chat, and we'll be sure to get to those. But it was serendipitous that all those diverse perspectives aligned. And I kind of just want to double click on each of your perspectives before we kind of talk about some of the risks and how we can mitigate them. So, Payal, you're investing across multiple companies. You're seeing a variety of different kind of levels of maturity and adoption. I'm really curious what you see from this position and kind of things and lessons learned that you can share with the group about kind of your diverse perspective on, how people are approaching this opportunity.
Yeah, and I do think it goes back to a little bit of the boring or unsexy. When we're thinking about the health plan, and I see some questions in the chat about the value propositions for health plan and hospital systems, the biggest hard dollar ROI or juice to squeeze continues to be in the unsexy infrastructure back office lifeblood of these organizations. And that's where it's really important to make a distinction between traditional AI and AI that's been around for a long time, that is really the algorithms and the machine learning and the deep learning that is behind solving some of the use cases, and I'll come back to the use cases, versus generative AI, which is really appropriate for UX type use cases. And so for most of the world that we are living in, and most of the companies that we're investing in, are leveraging the huge advancements in traditional AI that are happening right now. And generative AI is, of course, something to pay attention to. But when you think about an enterprise use case, and you're thinking about, for example, automating coding and billing for a hospital system, that is loads and loads of traditional AI. There is, I mean, Gen AI, maybe if someone's interfacing with a UX that's going to, that will help on the output. But for the most part, there is a traditional there's tons of neural network, deep learning sort of stuff that has to go into solving that problem. And so I do think that a lot of the use cases that we're looking at are that unsexy back office, whether it's related to coding, billing, prior authorization. On the health plan side, I saw some questions on the chat about that. It's around similarly prior authorization, call center sort of optimization, or how do you remove, I think you could characterize the enterprise use cases that are most ripe right now for AI is how do you think about these FTEs where you have 20 to hundreds of FTEs focused on one task in the back office? How do you either eliminate that or shift those resources to something that's higher value? And that's where we're seeing most of the opportunity right now across both the existing portfolio as well as the companies that we're looking to invest in.
Thank you. Andrew, curious from what you're seeing, I'm glad that the concept of trust has been brought up kind of right off the top in terms of especially consumer-facing healthcare opportunities. So I'm curious what you're seeing in the space as it relates to that. And as you're talking about empowering consumers, how do you also help foster and generate trust with some of your tools?
Yeah, we think a lot about the social signals that create trust digitally in other industries. When you think about you're on Reddit, someone writes a post, who's writing that post? You don't know that person, you don't know their credentials, but the up-down voting of other Reddit users is a means by which the best content kind of rises to the top. So there's a lot of like social proof that I think is really interesting and useful for consumer-facing technology. And in our situation, we started out using AI that Paula, you're using kind of like more traditional AI. Our program was built on like a deep neural network. So that's kind of weird to say that. That's like old these days. That used to be the sexy thing that you'd have a webinar on. But that's like the technology that we had really kind of worked toward for many years. And the root of that of our technology was actually a lot of consumer data of people anonymously tagging what questions they thought were useful or not, anonymously tagging what diagnoses they thought were in line with what their physician ended up telling them was the right answer. So we're using a lot of that kind of feedback data to power the underlying technology. And then as we're thinking about now layering in LLMs, I think LLMs to the point, Paula, you made about like it's a UX improvement. I would definitely agree with that because I think there's a lot of things we're able to do now that make the experience much more human-like in terms of just being able to take in a lot of open-ended input, express things back in a more kind of free-flowing way. But I also think it has allowed us to expand the scope of what we're doing well beyond kind of symptom checking in a really exciting way, such that you're able to answer a much broader breadth of types of use cases and questions and address them much quicker. And then the way that we're seeing the ability to create trust is that same kind of social proof. Like if we're generating an answer for someone and they're seeing like something that they don't agree with, there's a really easy kind of feedback mechanism back to us, and that allows us to create more guardrails around kind of responses that are sent back. And all of this has a lot of the caveats that should come into play here. Look, we're trying to replace a doctor, we're not trying to replace like a professional in this sense, but what we are trying to replace is this you randomly Googling and reading whatever that you might be reading. And so in comparison to that, I feel like this is a huge step up. But the benefit to that, say 2, 3, 4 years down the line, when millions of people are giving feedback, is that you can use that social proof. You can use all of that data to give, I think, more and more certainty around like you're giving a good answer. And so that's how we kind of see the evolution. It's like, put something out there that with the right warnings and the right caveats is useful enough, generate enough, have enough distribution that the data that coming in is really valuable, that then can provide better and better answers with more and more certainty and potentially more and more scope down the road.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and definitely a more authoritative source than kind of a random Google where you don't understand, if a source is authoritative or not. And so being able to aggregate that, get the feedback, and then have the continuous and ongoing monitoring is a really powerful application. So Rena, I'm gonna ask you your question, but then I'm gonna incorporate some of the questions I'm seeing in the chat, especially around that, physician AI relationship. You're closely aligned to this patient perspective. Are you skeptical? I think there were some questions around AI will be playing a co-pilot role to healthcare practitioners. How do we handle, cultural differences and these types of things? And so I think I've captured a few of those questions in the chat, but you've already kind of signaled that you do think this is going to happen, but do you have any kind of areas that you're concerned about or things that limitations that you see from that perspective?
Yeah, it's a great question, Alyssa. I love the skeptical question. We doctors are too often perceived as old and curmudgeonly and barriers to innovation, and well, some of us are, unfortunately. But we're kind of paid to be skeptics. It is our job to, for me, I'm a physician. I'm also been a scientist. I'm also an entrepreneur. My currency is proof and data points. And, I'm asking, I need to see the proof. I need to ask the questions. Healthcare, I think, is so very often shades of gray and not black and white. I mean, we just want so badly to bucket things and have clean answers. And healthcare is 99% nuance. And so I think we have to be respectful of the complexity of healthcare. So yeah, am I skeptical? Sure. But for good reason, I think it's sort of a mix of skepticism and hope/optimism, right? The other I just want to remember the questions that you were pulling from the chat. There was one about, I think, cultural competency and being able to utilize other languages, which is such a great question. Actually, my gut is a less skeptical answer to that question, which is, I think for one human to carry knowledge about all different languages and all different cultures is really quite challenging. And I actually imagine that AI will actually make it simpler for us to be thoughtful about cultural specificities in the care and management of patients. So I think there's actually more opportunity there than there is skepticism. And remind me, Alyssa, there was something else woven into your question I don't want to miss.
No, it was just, I think you've covered it well. It's just basically there's a lot of discussion around how we're all going to have a co-pilot, like whether you're a physician or, in any sort of function. So do you see having an AI co-pilot as a physician to be kind of part of your day-to-day?
Yeah, I think we have to. I think we've got to get there. And back to your point about trust, Andrew, you spent a lot of time talking about the trust with the consumer, which I think is absolutely necessary. I think there's a lot of trust building to do with the clinician community. Because it's like all things, novel technologies feel threatening. And that knowledge about medicine is our currency. That is what we train to do. And if you come in and say, hey, I've got this thing that can basically replace you, boy, that's scary. That's career threatening, right? So I think there's a lot of trust building that has to happen. We have to get there because the system cannot function without a marriage of human and data and technology. It has to get there. And so we have to build that trust underneath.
Yeah, and the thing is that, Rena, you talked about nuance, and Andrew, you talked about deep learning networks and so on, or deep neural networks. The thing with GenAI is that it's so easy for anyone to come up with a solution. And many of these solutions are just what we call thin wrappers and lack that nuance. and have these risks. We're going to talk about risks in the next section. But I think that really is where there's a trade-off between trust and how quickly you can do something. And I call it the spooky mountain. It's something you got to cross. And the trade-off or the strange thing about it is that the more nuanced you are, the better you are at solving things that otherwise you need humans for. But it also feels more uncomfortable because the AI is doing something that humans would do. And somehow we've got to get past that and build trust.
Yeah, but on the other hand, I think a more nuance would give physicians or clinicians more broadly more trust that it's actually accurate and, giving you data, information, or helpful co-pilot functions that you can actually trust, right? If everybody with chest pain has a heart attack, okay, that's not a tool I'm going to use. But if you can tease out what are the layers underneath and help me build a differential diagnosis, accounting for maybe some long past historical tidbit that I might not have been able to unearth in, layers and layers of EMR charts, records that look not dissimilar from one another, clinician visit over clinician visit. Okay, like now I'm starting to appreciate the value that the AI functionality can bring.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're observing something similar at least on the provider side. I'd bifurcate between the diagnosis and the alleviation of the unsexy work. And there's quite a bit of trust and desire to use it. So companies like Abridge, which are, co-piloting and alongside providers are being, at the moment, adopted with arms wide open by the providers. Because it's not, to your point, encroaching on their core competency of making the diagnosis, but it's helping with all of the pajama time elements of things,
Sure.
right? So I think there's even within providers, there's a bifurcation of where there's trust and where there isn't. But yeah, then
100% agree.
lots to say on the risk side, Nikhil. So I'm looking forward to that conversation.
Yeah.
Payal, I had a question just rolling back to something you said earlier and of focusing on the enterprise side, but with individual physicians adopting things, do you feel that's a sort of a backdoor way to get these kinds of tools into the enterprise? Are you looking
So
at
actually, yeah, it's a great question and observation, Satish. And it actually maybe just leads into the next. I think one of the biggest risks for companies that are going to be leveraging GenAI right now is the difference between individual adoption and enterprise adoption. And I was talking to my partner Graham Brooks, who sees this across vertical agnostic AI, and there are just so many POCs going on in enterprise land. Mayo Clinic is doing no less than 24 POCs in GenAI. So what does that mean? It means, your individual providers who may be using something in cardiology, but then the other ones who are using something in radiology, at the end of the day, the enterprise hasn't blessed either of them and is just watching to see what's delivering value. And at the end of the day, not both solutions are going to get chosen. It's going to be one, right? And so I think there's going to be a little bit of false signaling from the POCs. Now, if you go outside of healthcare, which I think is actually a better indicator of this, because verticals like financial services tend to be, more forward in things like AI than healthcare would be. Graham was telling me Capital One is doing over 200 POCs as it relates to generative AI, and there are 0 models in production. So the key thing is going to be, how do we, for any company or any entrepreneur that's starting a company, how do you cut through the noise of the POC and the individual adoption to get to the real wallet and enterprise adoption, unless you go the consumer route?
I think this is amazing pivot, because one of the things we hear often is we have all these POCs, we have all these options, but we are not confident that the right guardrails and responsible AI elements are in place to actually get it into deployment or operationalized. And so there's this friction between, I don't want to get left behind. I want to harness the competitive advantage, but we need to put some brakes on this to make sure that we can adopt it with confidence, trust, and safety. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Nikhil to kind of talk about this topic, and then we'll come back to the panel to discuss and talk about what's happening out there and how we can do our best to mitigate these risks.
Great. So once again, I'm going to set this up with just one slide. In the first webinar, we talked about a framework for thinking about AI responsibly. And so if you want to get more detail, I'd point you back to that first webinar to go into all of these. So I'm just going to touch upon them very, very briefly. So the NIST and others have come up with frameworks. The NIST seems to have put it all together into these 7 categories. And I know the Responsible AI Institute also uses them. And obviously, all of these are important in their own, in any application, and particularly in health. And so I've just thrown up some examples here of what it looks like in what it could look like in digital health if things go wrong. So, and Andrew, I'm not looking at you right now, but what happens if your solution is not valid and reliable, which means it doesn't work under the conditions it's supposed to work in? So a symptom checker makes a recommendation that goes beyond its training data. Or what happens if there's a safety implication, which, while you pointed out that people are really excited about all of these back office applications where there's not much of a safety implication. But when you think about, taking a reading from a loop recorder and deciding whether someone needs an intervention or not, that's, could result in a safety issue. Security and resiliency is really about what happens to a system when it is attacked or it is put under stress. And so, what happens if a hacker compromises the data in a system? How do we think about that from a digital health perspective? There was a question in the chat about, so I'm jumping ahead, sorry. Accountability and transparency. You have to be transparent first, and then you can be accountable. And in healthcare, who is liable when something goes wrong? And so the first step is really always disclose. And I'd love to have the panel talk a little bit about disclosures and accountability. The question in the chat was about explainability. And so if you don't know how or why an AI radiology read had a certain recommendation, it's really hard to trust. And so that's another important point. And then there was a question in the chat as well about whether PHI is shared with the LLM. And it's not so much about whether it's an open source or closed sourced LLM. Of course, that's important. In fact, in some cases, open source is better because you can know what's going to happen to your data. But then enterprise relationships with OpenAI and other companies, other foundational model companies, do enable you to guarantee that your data stays within your enterprise. And then finally, bias. We haven't had much conversation today about bias. In the last session, when we talked about biotech, we had a fair discussion about bias. It's not, and bias steps in at every step, right from how you train to how the model is built, and in fact, even how a healthcare practitioner interprets what's coming out of the AI. So just wanted to set this up as a framework to prompt some discussion on the risks and how to be responsible about dealing with them. Alyssa?
Thank you. Just some small, light topics for all of us to grapple with, of course. I think this is a really important framing because we see it truly like having responsible AI practices that kind of cover these 7 dimensions of the NIST risk management framework, and they're very much aligned to what's happening internationally. We're also seeing that, specific guidance is coming. I think there was some great comments in the chat. Specific guidance is coming out from the FDA and others to give guidance on how to manage some of these things. So, I think for the remainder of this panel and answering some of the questions, I think the accountability, transparency, and interpretability piece is a really interesting discussion to kind of get your perspectives on. So as it relates to specifically accountability, I am going to pull one of the questions out of the chat. Does it have to be that doctors and physicians and others, humans, are always the ultimate decision maker? How do we deal with the accountability kind of discussion as it relates to recommendations from to and from physicians or other people in the healthcare system? Rena, I'm specifically kind of thinking about areas in which it actually might augment you, and you might not even have the guidance from a cultural perspective or the diagnostic kind of co-pilot that you might see. So I'm curious around the table, the thoughts around accountability as it relates to AI systems and outputs.
Yeah, it's a fabulous area for discussion because, yeah, traditionally accountability for health outcomes has fallen to the clinician. And when you start to weave in components of diagnosis and/or treatment, putting aside the boring back-end applications of AI, which I agree are wildly necessary, but in the actual patient care delivery pathway, yeah, I mean, a lot of the weight has fallen on the shoulder of the clinician, rightly so. But how do we start to balance that weight amongst other contributors to the decision making and the treatment? Yeah, I mean, I'd be curious from Andrew's perspective, right? Like, do you guys get pushback about what information is coming to your consumers, right? And if something doesn't quite jive or is worst case erroneous, do you guys bear some of the risk, right? Clinicians are always worried about malpractice, and ultimately, unfortunately, often practice with that specter in the back of their head. So yeah, I think it would be great to think about how to distribute some of the weight of the responsibility across all contributors to diagnosis and treatment.
Yeah, I really like that, the way you're thinking about it, Rena. And maybe just to like directly answer your question, this was one of, if not the biggest barrier that we faced when we were selling into kind of the big insurance companies and the employers and the health systems, which was how do you create the guardrails that ensure or minimize like the worst possible outcomes. And for us, that meant actually building, I guess, dumber tools that sat alongside our kind of sexier neural networks, and ultimately LLMs is like the next version of that. That were those guardrails. So just like a really explicit example, we had what we called an alarm system that mirrored the protocols that nurses would use when they're on a phone call with a patient via like a nurse call center. And if someone basically stated that they had, say, take the heart attack example, Rena, that you gave earlier, if someone came in with chest pain, it would basically flag that particular visit and go through a set of questions that was predetermined to either rule in or rule out the likelihood of a potential MI. And not saying that we are diagnosing the person with a heart attack, it's more saying we're kind of making this delineation between this person is stable enough to continue on with I guess, the more generative AI component, or they are completely unstable and we need to kick them out. And that product is something, the consumer doesn't really see. They don't see that this is any different than kind of our usual experience. But from like an audit perspective or an explainability perspective, we're able to show that to our partners and say, oh yeah, you can actually walk through the reasoning here. And that is the guardrail that like protects us from kind of these really, really bad outcomes, which really are around like the false negatives, I would say are like the most egregious and hard to measure, problems. And I would say that for companies that are, giving some sort of a ruling or some sort of like a decision, that they should be bearing some of that burden from a risk perspective. And in general, just from like an overall risk perspective, I feel like there needs to be kind of an apples to apples comparison. Not comparison, I'm sorry, an apples to apples a treatment of humans who make decisions and technology that makes decisions. And so if the technology is making a decision, it should bear risk just like the human bears risk. And then further though, when it comes to bias, when it comes to mistakes, how do we know that a clinician is or is not biased? Like, how are we testing that? How are we measuring that? How are we measuring whether a clinician is making a good or a bad decision about someone's care? How are we, like, what are those standards? I would say many of them don't exist. So if they don't exist for the human, what are we going to use to judge like the person? Or sorry, judge the AI, so that we can either say, oh, okay, that was actually a really good, this is a net improvement over what we're doing, or this is worse or it's the same. find it somewhat frustrating at times, you know, to whenever people think about a computer, it's this automatic, like, okay, if it's not 99.999% right, then we can't use it. And that to me just doesn't make sense from like an overall utility to society perspective. And so going to the risk perspective, I feel like one of the biggest risks will be kind of a lack of consistency with how we evaluate tools, and not just the tools themselves, but relative to what they could or could replace or augment, which is the human.
You brought up two great points, and I am cognizant we only have about 5 minutes left, but I'm glad you brought up the fact that like the threshold and where those are set in terms of confidence is a really big piece. And how do we decide that? And that like humans are notoriously kind of biased decision makers and emotional decision makers. And so we do need to kind of consider what trust things need to be in place that we start to trust machines and outputs more. I'm also glad you brought up dumb models, or, you know, there is a decision that we can make that might change the, you know, overall performance of a system, but that allows us to mitigate bias a little bit more easily, depending on the type of algorithm we use, that might be more explainable and interpretable. So almost like the first principles conversation, do we need to use the most complex model? Maybe not necessarily. And so that's one area that we often think about when kind of mitigating. Kyle, I'm sure given the number of kind of conversations you have, you talk about this a lot, like even from an investing perspective, like, you know, what kind of risks, what kind of things do you have in place to make sure that your investment is safe? So we have 4 minutes left, so I would love your initial thoughts or final thoughts, and we'll kind of wrap it up after that. But I'm sure you have a lot of, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the questions in the chat. It just proves that this was a really dynamic topic and conversation.
Yeah, no, thanks, Alyssa. And there are so many topics on my mind, but I'll leave one that you with one that hasn't been mentioned, which is to some extent, because of these topics, there's a company that is going to be successful needs access to tremendous amounts of data. Yeah, tremendous amounts of data. And so therefore, and that's what's going to help with sort of the trust and being able to bear the risk. You have the scale of both the access of the data and probably the scale of just the enterprise that you are. And so unlike in other areas of healthcare tech, we are paying more attention to some of the incumbents here, like Google just came out last week, right, with their, DeepMind is doing the LLM that's focused on clinical diagnosis, where one would be a little bit more, I'll use the word skeptical of what one of the incumbents could accomplish in and against enterprise healthcare. This is one where we are having to and forced to pay more attention to the incumbents just because they do have access to more data. Right, Google's got the partnership with the hospital systems. They've got the cloud access, et cetera, and they can take on the risk of it. Should risk and being liable for the risk be a factor here? So I just keep that in mind for folks who are thinking about entrepreneurship in the spaces, that this is one to pay particular attention to the incumbents.
Amazing, thank you so much.
Actually, just very quickly on that, it's really interesting that when you use the term incumbents, you mean the Googles of this world. In healthcare, we typically think of incumbents as the big hospital systems and payers. But this is different because it is these tech incumbents that actually have the view across multiple entities.
Yeah, and it's both. I mean, we're paying attention to Mayo, for example, but they're partnering with Google. So I think this is one example where the healthcare incumbents are partnering with the tech incumbents, because that's the only way to really leapfrog and provide a solution. But we are paying attention to both, and there's just really high scrutiny around a startup or an earlier stage company in the space, just because of the pace or the rate of change with these collaborations that are happening amongst the larger entities.
So there's, like I mentioned, a number of questions in the chat that we haven't had a chance to get to, but we have another session coming up where a lot of these questions will be addressed, and we can have the discussion as we think about our subsequent events here. So Want to thank all of the panelists. This was an amazing discussion. I know I kind of went a little bit off script a few times, but it was fantastic to get all the dynamic perspectives. And I think, if anything, it's just given us a lot to think about and kind of a path forward on the questions that we all have to work together to answer. So we'll capture the recording. We'll be sure to share it. And just to wrap us up and talk about what's next for us, I'm going to hand it back to Satish to wrap us up. But thank you so much for having us.
Thank you, panelists. Thank you for a great session. And we roll on with a couple more webinars coming out. So please keep an eye out on both the DQ website as well as the Responsible AI website. And we'll be sending out for the next month and the following month. So looking forward to seeing all of you. Thank you very much.
Have a great rest of your day.
Yeah.
Everyone.